Hi, everyone. Really good evenings. Thanks very much for joining us to talk about something absolutely critical, which is corruption in politics. I'm Adam Bandt. I'm the Federal Member of Parliament for Melbourne, and I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that we are all on stolen land in this place that we call Australia, and that we've got a lot of work to do to tell the truth about the violence and dispossession that lies at the heart of this country, this place that we call Australia, and tell the truth about that, and then move forward with some real healing so that we can have a treaty and then actually move forward as equals, because we don't have a treaty with our First Nations peoples, and it is something that will mean that we can never progress in Australia because it means we're not telling the truth. And I'm very proud to be part of a party that puts treaty as core to something to campaign for and push in this country that we call Australia. We're here tonight to talk about corruption, and I really want to thank not only you for joining us and giving us your time tonight, but to people who have been taking up the fight really in the Parliament for many years now to say, look, we need to have an independent commission against corruption, not only at the state level, but at the federal level as well. Because if you believe that somehow corruption stops at the Canberra border, then I've got a bridge to sell you. It's we have in federal Parliament what is a corrupted system of politics, because we have big donations being made to the people who make decisions in Parliament, often who make decisions about the people who made the donations to them. And sometimes even the donations get made while the minister's sitting there deciding whether to say yay or nay to a particular planning project or a decision about a government grant or a government tender. So we have a system at the moment that allows big money to do a lot of talking in politics and determine what decisions get made by whom. So democracy in many respects is for sale. And we have seen at the state levels independent commissions at corruption root out corruption and root out wrongdoing, and people have ended up in jail as a result of it. But we don't have one at the federal level. And so this evening we're going to talk a bit about why we need one. And it comes today because we're marking 1,000 days since the Liberal government, told us that we were going to see Canberra join many other states and have an independent commission against corruption. And guess what? We don't have one. We still don't have one. And we've been pushing hard, and we're going to hear a bit about what we've been doing in Parliament to establish a federal independent commission against corruption. If the government's not going to do one, then we're going to do one we're going to push them to do it. But even then, they won't do it. And why? Why is it that we're still, 1,000 days on and the Liberals haven't set up an independent commission against corruption? Well, it makes you wonder what they've got to hide. And the Greens, because we don't take those donations from the big corporations and the developers, we know the corrupting influence that that money can have over politics. We are going to push until we see this independent commission against corruption established. And joining us this evening, chatting with us, is Larissa Waters, who's the Greens deputy leader and the leader in the Senate, and also our spokesperson on democracy, including independent commission against corruption. Hi, Larissa. How are you going?
Hi, Adam.
Yeah, good.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, likewise. And also joining us is David Shoebridge, who's Member of Parliament from New South Wales and is also the Greens candidate for the Senate in New South Wales, and has a lot to tell us about the history of corruption in New South Wales and also leading the fight against it. Hi, David. How are you going?
Yeah, hey, Adam. Lovely to be here, coming to you from Gadigal land.
Yeah, thanks all for joining us, and thanks everyone for giving us your time in wherever you are in this country. Some of you might be locked down like us. Some of you might be living the good life. Some of you might be in a cave somewhere, living probably a better life than many of us elsewhere. And I hope that whatever situation that you're in at the moment, you're staying safe and looking after those close to you. And, if you haven't got the jab, please go and get the jab, because we all need to get protected in order to get on top of this. But I want to just ask you, I'll ask you both, but perhaps ask you first, Larissa. You've said, I think recently, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, that if there was an independent commission against corruption at the federal level, we might say goodbye to half of Scott Morrison's cabinet. Tell us, you've been pushing in Canberra, leading the charge for the Greens to get a federal commission against corruption. Tell us, why do we need one, and how close are we to getting one?
Great question. Well, I'd like to see the back of all of Scott Morrison's cabinet, not just half. But if we had a strong corruption watchdog, then half of those bozos in cabinet that are conducting themselves disgracefully with all sorts of integrity scandals and even accusations of rape, it's unbelievable the lengths to which they've sunk. Half of those people would be potentially facing that corruption watchdog. So it's perhaps no wonder why we're still waiting for one. I think there's an awful lot of skeletons that are on show, but there's still probably an awful lot of skeletons in the Morrison cabinet closet. It's been 1,000 days since Morrison finally agreed that the Commonwealth, as the only jurisdiction without some kind of corruption watchdog, 1,000 days since Morrison finally agreed that, yes, this was necessary, after, of course, he'd initially said it was a fringe issue and that there was nothing to see, no problem, which is just completely laughable. They've taken so long, and they've done...
It's only democracy. It's only democracy, right? Just a fringe issue like democracy.
Right, that's right. Having elected representatives act in the interests of the people that support them and that they're meant to represent, details. So we passed a bill through the Senate, which is actually no mean feat, because often bills from smaller parties like ours takes a bit of negotiation to get the support from a whole chamber to have that passed. But we passed a bill for a strong corruption watchdog with teeth about 2 years ago. But it's no surprise that, because of course you need a bill to pass both houses of Parliament, the government haven't brought that bill on for a debate in the House of Reps, because they don't want a watchdog that works. They want a watchdog that kind of looks a bit like a watchdog but has no teeth and has no real power to hold any of them to account. So we saw the government put out a discussion paper 2 odd years ago and a draft bill about a year ago, which they keep sending for rounds and rounds of consultation, and they keep ignoring the consultation feedback when they get it. So it's pretty clear they actually just don't really want to do it. But in their version, it's just designed, I think, to allow corruption to continue, because it essentially doesn't apply to politicians. It sets the bar for what is considered corruption so high that it's virtually unreachable. Doesn't have the power to hold public hearings, doesn't have the power to initiate its own investigations. It essentially has to wait for the minister or the person who's done the wrongdoing to dob themselves in before it would even have jurisdiction to operate. So it's essentially a joke of a proposal, and all of the experts have agreed that they've all completely panned the government's version. Meanwhile, our version, with teeth, could have public hearings, applies to politicians, applies to anyone who's seeking to corrupt the conduct of a public official. So that's MPs, it's also public servants if they were, on the take or sought to be influenced in a negative way. It's got great protection for whistleblowers. It's got a counterpart bill which would set up a code of conduct for politicians. It's really the full suite of what should have been in place many years ago that might have deterred some of this revolting and dodgy and just embarrassing conduct that we've seen from so many federal politicians, which, puts us all, makes us all look bad, really. It's no wonder that trust in democracy is at an all-time low when you see what this government can get away with. And when you see how much corporate influence there is on decision-making, which is sort of the associated issue to this one. If we didn't have big money ruling decisions, then we might get some better quality decisions. So we need an integrity body. We need to clean up those donations laws and make sure that big money does not influence politics. And then we might actually get a chance at a democracy that works with people and can help deliver meaningful protection for those that need it, genuine sustainability, and a decent life for folks.
Can you just clarify? So the government has said, because they made this promise, because they know that people actually want one, because we've got the pressure on of having got a bill passed the Senate that could be ticked off tomorrow by Scott Morrison in the House, and we could have it in law tomorrow. You're saying the government's proposal that they've released, you couldn't actually have public hearings into politicians?
Yes, that's exactly right. It's essentially a protection racket It's a massive fig leaf that will just allow all of this dodgy conduct to continue. And we asked the Parliamentary Library to scrutinise the government's proposal and whether it would have stopped any of the list of rorts that we've seen in the last 8 years of this government, sports rorts, the airport land they paid 10 times as much for, all of the various jobs that the former ministers go off and get in the areas that they were meant to be regulating 5 minutes earlier. The list goes on. We asked the library, would any of that conduct have been captured by the government's version of a corruption watchdog? And they said no. So,
Right.
I mean, what a joke. You couldn't design something that was more useless if you tried. And then they're stalling on that, and they keep consulting and reconsulting and ignoring the feedback. So if they're treading water, they don't want a corruption watchdog because they're obviously pretty worried about what it might do. And I think it's going to take a change of government with the Greens in the balance of power before we actually get a decent corruption watchdog to finally clean up the dodginess that federal parliament has become.
It's pretty amazing how Peter Dutton's pretty fond of saying to everyone else, if you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't be worried about our new surveillance powers that allow, inquiries into the activities of everyday citizens. And yet it's one rule for everyone else and quite another rule for them. Doesn't seem to apply to them. But David, that prohibition, the public hearings, not being able to fully inquire into politicians, I mean, it's a different story in New South Wales, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The ICAC in New South Wales, which is kind of like the I think probably the most effective anti-corruption body in the country, it has one of its critical roles is to actually have the public hearings. The public hearings themselves exposing what's going on, exposing grossly unethical conduct. I recall one of the most high-profile public hearings, which has now led to charges against 2 former Labor ministers in New South Wales, was about how coal licences were being basically handed from mate to mate, from minister to minister's mate. And that was all exposed in the public hearings. And the public hearings themselves, that kind of public spectacle and exposing what's going on is one of the really important anti-corruption measures, because if public officials and ministers know that there's that potential that their dodgy dealings are going to be so publicly exposed, and there's a sense of humiliation, which is dead right, I might say, if you're handing over tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of public money to your mates. That sense of public spectacle is a critical part of actually pushing it back against corruption. And you can see why politicians don't want it, because, I mean, that can be really, really powerful. And particularly when you realise that most of the country's formal anti-corruption laws, the laws that make it a crime to do X, Y, or Z, are pretty weak. If you're only going to rely upon a formal corruption hearing and a formal corruption charge, well, then, as Larissa was saying, a lot of the really unethical and dodgy conduct is not going to be picked up by a corruption inquiry. So, grant scandals, for example, you keep having government ministers say, well, I can do whatever I like. The law says I can send the money wherever I like. I don't have to pay attention to guidelines. I can give it to, party donors. I can send it where I like. And that's probably true in terms of the laws of the anti-corruption laws, the actual criminal law, but it's deeply, deeply corrupt conduct. And that's why you need a really broad definition of corruption. You need a really broad jurisdiction, and you need to ensure that you have the public hearing, because sometimes the only justice you get is the public hearing. And, quite often the conduct doesn't end up finding its way into a criminal court.
And what are some of the things that have been achieved in New South Wales? I mean, this isn't, it's not just about having the hearing, inquiring and exposing it. Like, it then goes on and has consequences sort of further down the chain once the ICAC's done its work, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, it's still New South Wales, Adam. So, it's a work in progress in terms of fighting corruption. We still have grand scandals and dodgy governments and all of that. But what it has done is, I think it's lifted the professionalism and fundamentally changed some of the core elements about the way government handles things, some of the coal licenses and the like. That has actually changed. It's still deeply crooked environmentally. There's still a bunch of multinationals with still access to it, but there's no longer that I can see direct backhanders being handed to actual government ministers. But I think it's also raised the bar of expectations for the public. Like, they expect corrupt conduct to be actually hunted down, and they are and they back ICAC. Like, it's very clear the public in New South Wales have a great deal more respect for the Independent Commission Against Corruption than they do for the politicians and the bureaucrats and the dodgy corporates that they are actually policing. There's huge support for a well-resourced independent anti-corruption agency once you get it up and running. And it's interesting to note that the only way we got it in New South Wales, it wasn't gifted by the Coalition and it wasn't gifted by Labor. The only way we got an independent anti-corruption commission in New South Wales was when we had a minority government and it was forced on both parties. It was actually forced on them, because it's astounding how, one or other side in opposition says, oh, I desperately want to have an anti-corruption body when I get in. When I get in, I'll put one in. And then their zeal kind of fades a bit when they get into government.
That's absolutely critical. I think that's a really, really important point. And Larissa touched on this before. Like Morrison at the moment, part of the reason I suspect the government doesn't want to press the button on this is because they know how many people are going to be affected on their side federally if there is a proper federal anti-corruption watchdog. And also they're hanging on to majority government by their fingernails at the moment. And so they're worried that, what if it exposes a scandal that means someone has to quit or someone gets prosecuted and has to go to jail? But the flip side of that, and this is Sharon's asked us why isn't the Governor-General, with all these scandals, bringing forth a vote of no confidence and saying that the government has to go, given the litany of scandals we've seen from this. Part of the reason is that we're trying to get the government to investigate itself, and they just don't want to do it. And the Governor-General will do what Scott Morrison advises him to do when it comes to calling an election. But I think, David and Larissa, your points about this are really crucial, because the flip side of that is that Morrison's hanging on by his fingernails, and it's only going to take a small shift in the vote to kick him out, right? But it's actually going to take a much more historic shift that we haven't seen much at all in the last 20 years for Labor to win a majority, because there's so many Greens and Independents in Parliament, right? So it'll be easy and very doable for us to kick this terrible government out. Much, much harder for Labor to win a majority in the House or the Senate. Like, it's probably, like, the polls suggest they won't be able to do it. History suggests they won't be able to do it, which means we're actually, if we can do our jobs and kick this government out, we're heading for a power sharing parliament where the Greens will be in balance of power in both houses of Parliament. And as David's just told us, like, that's how you get things like an ICAC, like a federal anti-corruption watchdog, and one with teeth, one that doesn't just have the appearance of being an ICAC, but the kind of one that Larissa has been pushing for with her legislation that says it's got to be able to hold everyone to account. And thanks. We've got a message from Nalan Panthera Leo saying thanks for being across all of this and holding them to account. That's part of our job. And but part of what we can do at this election is that if we end up in that situation where we have enough Greens in there sitting with the Independents, we'll be in balance of power, right? And this is something we've been fighting for so long. And as David says, this is how you get things like a federal ICAC. So I would say to everyone who's feeling a bit disheartened by the list of scandals, and we've got up in the comments, down, I'm not sure, somewhere, a list of the top 10 things that will be referring to the federal ICAC from this government, even when we get it established, is no, actually this time around, by voting for us who are pushing for this, because we don't take those donations from those corporations, this election is probably going to be one of the best shots we'll have to get it. And I think it would be a pretty good thing to get established. So David and Larissa, have you got some final comments for people? Because I know, like, there is a sense from a lot of people of, like, we just keep seeing this happen, and it's despairing, and it erodes people's trust and makes people think that they're not powerful. What message do you want to leave with for all the people who've tuned in tonight because they care about this and they want to see the big money taken out of politics? Larissa.
Look, I think I'd reinforce what you've just said, Adam. The Greens have been pushing for a federal corruption watchdog since 2009, and both of the big parties were saying for many, many years it was totally unnecessary. Then about 4 years ago, the Labor Party changed their mind after that sustained pressure from the Greens, and they said, all right, well, okay, I think we do need one. And then a year after that, the Liberals also agreed. although we've seen no action, we have at least changed their position on this issue. And that's why a vote for the Greens is so powerful, because we will push those issues that are inconvenient for the big parties, but that democracy and people deserve. So there's a real message of hope here. I can't wait to boot this awful government out. And with the Greens in the balance of power, we can deliver things like an ICAC that will work, that will finally clean up democracy. And so many of this dodgy conduct is actually legal. So we need those stronger donations laws to say, no, you can't make massive donations. If you're a big mining company, you can't just, take a minister out to lunch with 20 grand in a brown paper bag and then get the outcome you want. We need to rule that out. We need those strong donation laws so that big money stops buying outcomes and that actually democracy works for the people again. That's within reach at the next election. And I think it's keeping us all motivated.
David?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's as reachable as it's ever been. Like, it's within our grasp after this federal election to have not just any federal anti-corruption body, but one that actually is going to have teeth, one that's actually going to be able to do its work. And voting that up as one of the first items of business in the new parliament, I think would be an extraordinary positive thing for all those people who've wanted an ICAC, but also for cleaning up government. Because the other thing you've experienced in New South Wales is having the ICAC there gives you a target for when you're getting information together, when you're working with communities, when you're working with stakeholders and you're exposing wrongdoing. You have actually a target. You pull the information together. We do it through parliamentary hearings. We do it through, powers of the House to force the release of government information. You get the information together. You work with members of the community, you work with people who know what to look for, and then you send it off to ICAC and you actually get a result. Now, not perfect. ICAC doesn't have the funding it needs in New South Wales, and any federal ICAC needs to have guaranteed independent funding and the resources needed to do what it can do. But it's also that ongoing way of cleaning up politics and giving communities and stakeholders a really valid pathway to not only expose corruption, but get a result and kick some people out of their positions they should never have held in the first place.
Well, look, thanks, Larissa, and thanks, David, for everything that you're doing to push to get the big money out of politics and make sure that decisions are made by politicians for the public interest, not for vested interests. It is absolutely critical work, and it's hugely popular, and there's a reason for that. People know that there's something wrong in the way that we're making decisions at the moment in government, and that it needs to change. And so let's make this the year, or let's make next year the year. Whenever Scott Morrison decides to call the election, that we kick the Liberals out and put the Greens in balance of power and push the next government to establish a corruption watchdog with teeth. Thanks for all your work, Larissa and David, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, Larissa. Thanks, Adam.
Bye all. Take care.
Bye.